Neil Lazarus. Educating, motivating, challenging.
Welcome back to another podcast. This is Neil Lazarus, and yep, I know I've been away. I missed you. I hope you missed me. It's been the holidays here with Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, you name it. We've been doing it. And also I was away on holiday, so I apologise. But we're back with a new series of podcasts, so keep listening and keep tuning in. And you can always let me know what you think via Twitter, @AwesomeSeminars. @AwesomeSeminars is the way to be in contact, or just check out my Facebook page. You can look up Neil Lazarus and contact me there. Anyhow, during the summer I was driving, and I have to tell you this story. I was driving towards to speak to a group at the Dead Sea. It was early in the morning, and I love driving that time of day. The sun was rising and no one was on the road. It was quiet. The sun was coming up and I was driving towards the Dead Sea. Now, for those of you who've driven towards the Dead Sea, you know exactly the place I'm talking about. If you drive from Arad down, there's this corner where when you drive down there, you see the whole of the Dead Sea and Jordan in front of you. It's one of the most amazing places in Israel. Anyway, I was driving, nothing on the road, 6 in the morning, listening to Elton John on the radio. I was driving like a candle in the wind when suddenly there was a camel on the corner, sitting in the middle of the road. I was expecting the great view, which there always is, but there was a camel. I slam on my brakes because the reality is if you hit a camel, it's not good. It's really, really not good. If you think a pigeon is bad, try a camel. So I stopped. The camel was looking at me. I was looking at it. It was looking at me, and I was looking at it. And it seemed an eternity. I phoned my wife, and she's from England. And I said, how do you get rid of a camel from sitting in the middle of the road? She said, I'm from England. We don't have camels in the Finchley Road. Anyway, I carried on, and I didn't want to hoot, because what happens if it's stampeded? So I just waited it out. Finally, after about 4 or 5 minutes, a Bedouin, one of the nomads of the desert, came, took his camel, and with the little rope that they have around the mouth, pulled it away. What was so funny about the whole episode was that he didn't really realise that his camel was causing such a traffic jam, because he was so busy speaking on his iPhone, he didn't notice what had happened. For me, that's my Israel. On the one hand, you can counter things which haven't changed since the time of the Bible, yet on others, this guy was talking on a device which in part has been developed in Israel. We sell technology and startups to America, for Waze, for example. I think if we're to try and understand Israel, we need to get away from the immediate. We live in a society which is a very immediate society, and we need to, if we're to understand the future, look at the past. I know bashing Bibi is very popular, Netanyahu that is, both here in Israel and abroad. But to really understand Netanyahu, and to perhaps understand the Israeli foreign policy, as well as Israel's position towards the Palestinians, we need to stop, pause, and ask the question, which is, can we determine some characteristics of how Israelis think from our history and from our past? You see, I would argue that the West doesn't understand Israel. The West is caught in the immediate, the future, the instant. Elections in the States are discussed over Twitter, or perhaps in one-sentence sound bites of trickle-down Trump policy or crooked Clinton. My intention here is not to present Israel in 140 characters, but to understand Israel's foreign policy practices in a way that we should do, which is to first of all return to the very founding fathers of Israel, the very first Zionist thinkers. Now, I know many people consider Zionism a dirty word, but it's basically the concept of how do you solve a problem of people suffering from racism who are stateless. If that's not a question which is relevant for today and relevant in Europe, what question is? So At that time, in the early 1900s, the question was for the Jews. How do you create a state? What would a state look like? What would a Jewish state look like? And what we actually see is the essential to Israeli foreign policy today can be traced back to the Zionist thinkers and how they thought. How they perceived a Jewish state reflects many ways on how Israel, until today, sees itself, and perhaps even more importantly, if we're discussing foreign policy, how they see the non-Jewish world. I would argue, you see, that Israeli politics essentially is one simple question. What does it mean to be a Jewish democratic state? And what's that state's relation to the non-Jewish world? That's the essence of Israeli politics, in the same way perhaps American politics is what's the relationship between state and federal government. If we look at the early Zionist thinkers, and don't worry, I'm not going to give a whole lecture here on them, but I think it's important to recall that they actually set up the different pillars of how Israel sees the outside world. So if we look at, the mother of all, Herzl was convinced that anti-Semitism was a natural essence of a Jew living in the diaspora. So I would argue that Herzl's Zionism was somehow rejectionist of a concept of having normality with the outside world. The outside world would be anti-Semitic. The outside world was impossible for a Jew to live. In fact, Herzl didn't really see that Jewish communities could exist in that environment. You see, that strand of what I call rejectionist Zionism, this idea of we have to do what's good for the Jews, to quote Ben-Gurion or misquote Ben-Gurion, and it's not important what the non-Jews think, could explain many ways of how Israel deals with perhaps Europe. I recall Menachem Begin once talking about German Chancellor Schmidt, who had argued that Israel should recognize a Palestinian state. By the way, I found it on YouTube. I was thinking of playing it to you, but it's only in Hebrew, so if you're not a Hebrew speaker, you don't get how Begin was speaking, and he was the mother of all orators. He was a great speaker. Anyway, he turns around and he says, I, Menachem Begin, the man who fought the British, was in the resistance, I'm going to listen to you, the Germans, the people that killed my grandparents, a whole generation of us, and now you want to destroy us again by creating a Palestinian state? You see, if your concept of Zionism is a rejectionist Zionism, a belief of anti-Semitism as an inherent part of the non-Jewish world, then you can't have normality with your neighbours. You can't work with European countries. You can't even really trust America. But that was only one stream of Zionism. An arguing and countering claim of Ahad Ha'am, what I would perhaps call pragmatic or cultural Zionism, said, look, Herzl, you're not right. Jews will always live in the diaspora. We have to work both with the Jewish communities and other countries. We have to be, if you like, a central cultural cog in the wheel. Perhaps if you take that model today, you can understand the importance for Israel of Jews in the diaspora, such as America. American Jews aren't going anywhere, and I've been to West Palm Beach. I don't think the Jews there are suffering. The Ahad Ha'am model sees the possibility of a modern-day AIPAC, a concept of working together with modern Jewry to perhaps pressure the non-Jewish world. So you have two contradictory terms within Zionism already: Ahad Ha'am's rejectionist model, Herzl's rejectionist model, and Ahad Ha'am's more pragmatic cultural model. But there's more. The question of Jews living in Eretz Israel was perhaps the essential element of Zionism. And again, where in Eretz Israel has always been a part of the problematic nature of Israel with the Palestinians. Avraham Kook, rabbi, who was the founder of Messianic Zionism, of which many people until today, especially Knitted Kippot, are followers. You see, he was trying to work out how is it that many of the founders of the Zionist movement weren't actually religious. How could you account for that? And he argued that the very movement of Jews back to Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, would hasten the coming of the Messiah. That fundamental belief of a messianic process of Jews returning to Israel is very problematic in any future, today, 2016, 17, any possibility of giving up land for peace. You see, if land for peace is giving up land which would hasten the coming of the Messiah, well, there's no land to be given up. In contrast, again, you could perhaps see A.D. Gordon. He was a socialist Zionist. I remind you that the early Zionist thinkers were socialists, coming to plough the land. They saw that by labour itself, they would meet a higher purpose. In many ways, Zionism was a socialist movement. Zionism was also a humanistic movement, and sought to become a light unto the nations. That much more socialist, liberal, humanitarian issue also plays into today's concept of who Israel thinks it is or what it should be. And finally, you have the revisionist Jabotinsky, who were much more militaristic and perhaps much more expansionist, considering that both sides of the River Jordan should be considered Eretz Israel. To recap, you have Herzl, who was rejectionist, saying that anti-Semitism was natural, that you couldn't work with a non-Jewish world. Ahad Ha'am, who called for a pragmatism. Avraham Kook, who saw the Jews returning to the land, was messianic. You had A.D. Gordon, who was a socialist, and Jabotinsky, who was a revisionist, calling for a much more expansionist approach to settlement of the land. And I think within these elements you can understand much more today's present Israeli ideology. Now combine with that the Holocaust. You see, we don't have Israel because of the Holocaust. We had the Holocaust because there wasn't an Israel. It's different. But what are the lessons of the Holocaust? And that question, I think, plagues very much Israeli thinkers. What does it mean that we survived? Like I said, the early Zionist thinkers really provided the first thoughts, the first concepts of what a Jewish state was. They fertilized the idea. But the Holocaust were the birth pains of the Jewish state. And it was a difficult birth, a traumatic birth, which was going to traumatize the people. You see, did the Holocaust actually prove Herzl right, that the Jew in the non-Jewish world couldn't live in peace with its neighbours? Or did the Holocaust prove that perhaps we should be more pragmatic and be a light unto the nations? Those questions of what the Holocaust should be have plagued Israelis and their foreign and domestic policy. Just for one example, when Menachem Begin was talking about Sabra and Shatila and was criticised, he stood up in the Israeli parliament and said, if Hitler was in a building, would you not bomb the building? The next day, Amos Oz wrote a great article where he wrote in Yediot Achronot, Mr. Prime Minister, Hitler is dead. The shadow of Hitler, the ghost of Hitler, the ghost of the Holocaust, I would argue, until today plays an important part of Israeli self-perception. That fundamental fear of destruction, the fear that Israel alone should be responsible for its future, its fate, and its security, is an essential part of Israeli foreign policy. I don't think you can understand the near panic, if you like, of Netanyahu. Panic's not the right word. Hysteria, perhaps, of Netanyahu regarding the Iranian nuclear deal. If you don't understand the question of Holocaust, you see, Netanyahu's use of Holocaust imagery, I don't think was rhetoric. I think it was a reflection of a much more deeper concept of who and what Israel is. Netanyahu, and we'll discuss this a little bit later, is very, by nature, a strategic conservative. And I will talk about being a strategic conservative, which is not my term, a little bit later, like I mentioned. But let's have a look at some of the foreign policy challenges that Israel faces. One, let's look at the south. In the south of Israel today, the growth of ISIS in the Sinai is proving a challenge both to Israel and Egypt. You know, the old concept of the Middle East, which is your enemy's enemy is your friend, is very important. I would add the Israeli perspective, which is your enemy's enemy is your friend unless they're not, is even more relevant. Israel today in the south is playing a balancing game between Egypt, ISIS and Hamas. I remind you that even as we speak, Egyptian warplanes are striking in the Sinai ISIS targets. Yeah, the question is Hamas in Gaza. Hamas is the Muslim Brotherhood, and I remind you that President Sisi replaced the Muslim Brotherhood. President Sisi sees Hamas as the Muslim Brotherhood, which should also be replaced in many ways, and at the same time sees it helping ISIS in the Sinai. Quite often, Israel has turned around to Egypt and said that they should not take such drastic action against ISIS and even Hamas. You see, the fear is that if you get rid of Hamas in Gaza, you would actually increase the power of ISIS. At the moment, what we're seeing is something very strange. ISIS and Hamas are in collusion, yet they're also in competition. Israel is in favour in many ways of keeping the status quo in Gaza. Yet it's a dangerous game. On the one hand, we don't want to get rid of Hamas because you create a vacuum. Yet on the other hand, it's clear that Hamas is getting stronger, building tunnels, increasing its range of weaponry, and will be more powerful in the next round. In the north, Syria has collapsed. And perhaps more importantly, what we're seeing is the growth of Russia in regional politics. Israel's situation in the north is multi-layered and complicated. On the one hand, we're seeing Israel move towards Russia, talk to Russia, increase its connections with Russia, perhaps out of no other choice, perhaps as a result of the decline in Israeli-American relations under the Obama administration. Yet at the same time, we know that Russia is arming Hezbollah. If you want a failure of Netanyahu's government, Netanyahu failed to stop that rearming taking place. Contacts are taking place between Israel and Russia over the provision of long-range weapons, but Israel seems to be unable to stop them. Moreover, Israel has taken action, military action, so it's reported, against this weaponry. So there seems to be a very strange relationship. Talking to Russia, increasingly talking to Russia, being more open with Russia, yet at the same time, Russian interests are not always in the interests of Israel. Meanwhile, we're also seeing on the Golan Heights the rise on the other side of the Israeli Golan Heights, the growth of Al-Qaeda and al-Nusra on the border, with quite often mortar fire coming over the Golan Heights and Israel responding. I think Israel's major concern at the moment is not that of Al-Qaeda and al-Nusra. That's perhaps a longer-term problem. The problem of a strengthened Hezbollah, armed and dangerous, and unpopular at home, needing to prove itself, is a potential disaster. Meanwhile, Israel, I think, has, as we have seen, allowed itself to attack Hezbollah weaponry without the fear of retaliation. On the east side, Jordan shouldn't be ignored. We're seeing the turmoil of the refugees, and the very future of the king could be under question. Israel and Jordanian pilots actually trained over Alaska during a military exercise in the summer of 2015. Israel also has given Jordanian military 16 Cobra helicopters to help in its fight against the Islamic State. It's funny, those right wingers who say that Jordan is Palestine. Well, let's be honest. No one wants Jordan to be Palestine. That's the last thing you need down our longest border. So Israel's looking nervously at the future of Jordan. You see, just say if, because it's always fun to play if, the Jordanian regime was threatened or weakened by refugees or by an ISIS attack, the refugees from any destabilized Jordan would come towards Israel. And I remind you, 70% of that population of Jordan is Palestinian. That would be an irony if they said, we're back. Turkey. Turkey is increasingly playing an important role in the region. I remind you of the 2010 Marmara incident where Israeli forces, and we've discussed this in other podcasts, landed on a ship coming towards Gaza, killing members of the boat's crew who were resisting. We also remember that on June the 29th this year, Israel approved the reconciliation agreement where Israel paid $20 million. Turkey is important to Israel. It's important for Israel long term to be a means of exporting gas to Europe, which in itself could put Israel against Russia's long-term goals of also exporting gas. Meanwhile, to counter or balance some of the more problematic relations with Turkey, we've also seen Israel increase its relationships with Greece. I think Israel can be described in many ways as becoming age 21. It's now seeking to be much more independent in its foreign policy, again, especially in relationship to the United States. The signing of the Iranian deal weakened Israel's position. I would argue it gave a death blow to AIPAC. If AIPAC couldn't stop the Iranian deal, it proved that it actually wasn't as all-powerful as it thought. So Israeli-American relationships, in the light of Iran, and perhaps even before that, are now much weaker. As I mentioned, I think Israel has become age 21. What do I mean by that? It's becoming independent. It's becoming wishing to make its own decisions. It doesn't want to listen to its parent Israel. Yet it's still dependent financially on the goodwill of America. Yet, like every 21-year-old, it wants to seek new relationships, and it's been sleeping around a little bit. It's looking for friends with benefits. Yes, Russia, as we discussed, is a friend with benefit, but perhaps China as well should be noted. Today, Israel has around $11 billion in joint trade agreement with China. Also, India has had an increase in sales. It's estimated that Israel is India's second largest arms supplier, with an estimated annual sales between $1 billion and $1.5 billion. But the realignment in the Middle East and the fundamental changes in the Middle East which are taking place have also provided benefits for Israel. You see, we always talk about the threat of Iran, and we talk about the threat of destruction, the threat of Iran getting a nuclear bomb. But the reality is, we're also seeing that concept of your enemy's enemy becoming stronger. So today, Saudi Arabia is even more closer to Israel than it ever has been in the past. I remind you, in 2011, Israel gave the green light to Germany for the sale of the Leopard 2 tanks to Riyadh. And when Egypt wanted to hand over the strategic Red Sea islands of Tehran to Saudi Arabia, Israel didn't object. So much so that in July we saw a retired Saudi general and ex-government advisor visit Israel in the Knesset and the Foreign Ministry. Saudi Arabia, as you know, has offered Israel peace back in 2001. Perhaps even more interesting, which went a little bit under the radar, was that in late 2015, Israel announced plans to open a diplomatic office in the Renewable Energy Agency in the United Arab Emirates. This is Israel's first diplomatic presence in the Persian Gulf region since 2000. Less noticed by commentators is one of the more interesting breakthroughs, and I would argue successes, of Benjamin Netanyahu, and that's in the African front. In July 2016, Netanyahu returned from a resoundingly successful tour of Africa. In that tour, there were a number of quite significant breakthroughs. We saw Ethiopia and Kenya publicly supporting restoring Israel's observer status of the African Union. We saw a Muslim-majority Guinea renew ties with Israel, which had been suspended since 1967. And we even saw Tanzania. I'm on too much coffee here. Had promised to open up an embassy in Israel. Which brings us perhaps to our last subject when we look at Israel and Israeli foreign policy, and that's the question of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Netanyahu has seen, on the one hand, the question of Gaza, and we've talked about the question of Gaza and the sense of containment rather than revolution. Yet at the same time, we've seen a rise in violence, of stabbings, of Molotov cocktails, and what some people are calling the Third Intifada. A recent poll actually came out of Palestinian public opinion, which showed that half of the Palestinian public believed that the current popular confrontation, or what's called the Haba Shababiyya, is over, and the other half believes it's still going on. Support for knifing attacks continues to decline, but 2/3 support a recent Jerusalem bombing on a bus. Expectations that the current confrontation will develop into an armed intifada continue to diminish, and 54% of Palestinians surveyed support the return of an armed intifada. This is according to a policy of the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey. What we're seeing, therefore, is what Nathan Sachs, in the Foreign Affairs article, Why Israel Waits, called a strategic conservatism. Netanyahu is a strategic conservative. What does that mean? It means that many people would say that Netanyahu is just sticking his head in the sand and he's being obstinate. But the reality is, if you take an ideology which was based on both Jabotinsky, Herzl, then it's better to do nothing than make a move which could contain some form of risk. You see, doing nothing can actually be a policy. Conservatism is Netanyahu, not rejectionism. By doing nothing in a world and in a Middle East which seems so dangerous, maybe that's the best way forward, the government would argue. Yet I think that policy is short-sighted, because doing nothing is a choice as well. And by doing nothing, you're condemning a whole new generation of Palestinians towards hatred towards the Israelis, and vice versa. What we have seen, though, is that the concept of how Israel sees itself is balanced between a reality of a radically changing Middle East, and at the same time rooted in a history of ideology which goes as far back as the very Zionist movement itself.
Neil Lazarus. Educating, motivating, challenging. Neil Lazarus. He must be clever. He's got a British accent.